welcome everyone. This is really exciting. We're kicking off this month-long course. We're doing this on a webinar, so you are able to ask questions and we will be answering that towards the end of the class. But if you have any questions coming up, there is a Q&A box. Throw those questions in. We want to keep this discussion lively, so please don't be shy. And without further ado, I will turn this over to our wonderful co-hosts. We have Dr. Heidi Hutner, who is an associate professor at Stony Brook University. She writes about environmental issues, and currently she's working on a documentary, Accidents Can Happen, The Women of 3 Mile Island, as well as a companion book of the same name. Her writing appears in New York Times, Ms. Mag, Long Reads, PRI, Aeon, Yes, Dame, and others. She has books and chapters in books with Oxford, UP, UVA, and more. She hosts the webisode Coffee with H×2, a sustainable interview series. Don't miss her TEDx, Eco-Feminism and Eco-Grief. And we also have with us co-hosting Dennis Yerry, an Iroquois musician, composer, and environmentalist. For many years, he was the director of the Native Day of Thanksgiving at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. And he has worked on many projects in film, television, and theater. He's currently the musical director of Unto These Hills in Cherokee, North Carolina, and has continued to use his music as a conduit to aid Native American and environmental issues. And the song that was playing when you entered was a Dennis Yerry original. So I'll turn it over to these wonderful co-hosts.
Hello, everyone. Heidi's muted.
Gotcha. I gotcha, Heidi. Hold on. There you go. You should be unmuted now.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rivka. Thank you, Dan. So glad to be here. Thank you, Dennis, for hosting with me, and welcome, Dr. Michael Mann. Really just so thrilled to have you with us. Your reputation precedes you, and I just love reading your work, following you. And I'd like to just make a little introduction and then we'll begin. So Michael Mann is a distinguished professor of atmospheric science. He's the director of Earth System Science Center at Penn State. He is he has a joint appointment with the Department of Geosciences and Earth and Environmental Systems. He is also the director of the Penn State Earth System Science Center. Dr. Mann received his undergraduate degrees in physics and applied math from the University of California at Berkeley, an MS degree in physics from Yale University, a Ph.D. in geology and geophysics from Yale University. His research involves the use of theoretical models and observational data to better understand Earth's climate system. Dr. Mann was a lead author on observed variability and change chapter of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, third scientific assessment report in 2001, and was organizing committee chair for the National Academy of Sciences Frontiers of Science in 2003. He has received a number of honors and awards, including NOAA's Outstanding Publication Award in 2002 and selection by Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology in 2002. I can go on and on. He's just got an extraordinary vita here. Dr. Mann is also the author of more than 200 peer-reviewed and edited publications, numerous op-eds and commentaries, and 4 books, including Dire Predictions, Understanding Climate Change, The Hockey Stick, and the Climate Wars Dispatches from the Front Lines, The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics and Driving Us Crazy, and The Tantrum That Saved the World. We'll be talking in this conversation about his forthcoming book, so I'll leave that to a little bit later. And I would just like to begin with the question, the sort of obvious. If you could talk to us now about where we are in this moment of COVID and in our current climate crisis, where are we, and what can you tell us about what's happening?
Yeah, well, thanks, Heidi. Thanks for the kind introduction. And it's great to be here with you today to have this conversation at what I actually think is a very critical juncture. And you're right. We live in this very unusual world right now with social distancing measures, aimed at stemming this pandemic. And it has sort of been it's interrupted our way of life, but it's also provided us an opportunity to sort of stop and take stock and think a little bit more about, our vulnerability. This has been a lesson. COVID-19 is a lesson in hubris, really, when it comes to, the vulnerability that, that we have trying to maintain 7 billion and growing people on a planet with finite resources. And there's an interesting conversation to be had about whether the pandemic itself is indicative of some of the challenges we're now facing when it comes to environmental sustainability, the fact that exotic species, we're now coming into contact with exotic species that we didn't in the past because of deforestation and the destruction of natural ecosystems. So we're in this very interesting moment right now where we have a sense about how vulnerable we are. We are seeing sort of the classic clash between sort of science and reason on the one hand and vested interests on the other hand. When it comes, for example, to a president who currently wants to reopen our economy prematurely to try to jumpstart an economy, when we're not ready to do that, and we will suffer the consequences health-wise if we do that. And so it's a clash between sort of the forces of corporate the sort of corporate interests, business interests on the one hand, and the interest of the people on the other hand. And of course, that's the same battle that we see when it comes to climate change. Some of those same vested interests, fossil fuel interests, have fought tooth and nail to prevent us from decarbonizing our economy, getting off fossil fuels, moving towards renewable energy, moving towards a more sustainable world. And so there are so many common themes, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that when it comes to the current pandemic, which is sort of an acute, hopefully relatively short-term crisis that we face, and the existential longer-term crisis that we face when it comes to climate change. That having been said, I'm somewhat optimistic. Just this week, we saw some very important developments with regard to several pipeline projects that were going to expand fossil fuel infrastructure for natural gas and oil that have been blocked or terminated. And the House Democrats have put forward a very compelling climate bill that might actually have a chance to become law depending on this critical upcoming election in November. So I'll leave it there, and we can sort of touch on any of these, these facets of that, the sort of where things are today and what the opportunities are moving forward.
No, it's a lot of complex things taking place right now, and I'm sure a lot of those factors are going to play into what we can do, what actions we can take. But it's remarkable, the 2 pipelines issues.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Three pipelines.
Oh, I didn't know about the 3rd.
Dakota Access, the East Coast Pipeline, and now what's the Keystone XL.
Oh, okay.
Is now temporarily blocked, and probably for a long enough time frame that it will be permanently blocked if we have a president in office next year who, as Joe Biden has said, will remove their permit. So that's so there. We are very much sort of on the precipice where, depending on what happens over the next 6 months, we could see a real path towards progress on climate.
That's so exciting. So I was following you on Twitter and social media. You were in Australia during our previous big crisis, right? Which was all of these fires were taking place. And then you happened to be in Australia. Yeah. It was a sabbatical, if I'm correct.
That's right, yeah.
So it was really terrifying to see what you were witnessing, and through friends of mine who are in Australia, knowing and following that story. Can you talk about that? Why, number one, for people who might not know, why are we having these fires, extraordinary fires in California as well, and what's happening there? Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, so it was sort of an unusual sort of coalescence of things that I happened to be arriving in Sydney for a sabbatical last December to study the impact of climate change on extreme weather events in Australia. And I had, that had been planned out for more than 2 years. So I had no way to know that I would be arriving, at a time when Australia was arguably facing the most extreme bout of, of extreme weather, an unprecedented extreme weather event, if you like, in the form of massive sort of continental scale drought and heat. And, it's not rocket science, as I like to say. You take unprecedented heat and unprecedented drought, you put those things together, you're going to get massive wildfires or bushfires, as they call them down under. And it's, pretty straightforward, actually. There was a report that was published more than 10 years ago by Australian scientists, which made a prediction. They said, the continent is getting drier, it's getting hotter. We're starting to see increases in these bushfires. By 2020, it will become obvious. The signal of climate change will become clear. And of course, in 2020 is when we saw this unprecedented, like I said, continental scale fire, wildfires across the continent, and where I was in Sydney, Australia, and New South Wales, where some of the most severe wildfires were taking place. And indeed, we saw massive destruction of native habitats. The koalas of New South Wales are now an endangered species because of the destruction that took place. Australia actually tripled their carbon emissions for the entire year based on the carbon that was released from those bushfires. And that raises interesting questions about some of the so-called positive feedback, some of the amplifying factors where the changes in climate creating these massive bushfires is actually accelerating the loss of carbon from our soils and forests, increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, amplifying the problem. But needless to say, it was very unfortunate, what happened there. And yet it did, if there's a silver lining, it created an opportunity. And I was there for, that very important teaching moment where there was an opportunity for Australians to really understand that this is the face of climate change. It's not some far off, distant problem, off in the Arctic. It's not just about polar bears. It's about unprecedented heat and drought and bushfires that are destroying homes, leading to loss of life and massive loss of critical habitats. It really brought climate change home, I think, for Australians, and really for me. It was really the first time that I came face to face with the impacts of climate change in such a profound way. And it influenced this book, my latest book, because it really, drove home for me the reality that we face, that, dangerous climate change has arrived. And it's simply a question at this point about how bad we're willing to let it get.
Thank you. It was extraordinary to watch you there, and then to see the all of the media on the koala and also on the air quality. Yeah. I had been in Sydney the year before, and just beautiful clear skies, and it was you couldn't go outside in Sydney. Am I correct? You couldn't. It wasn't safe to breathe.
No, that's right. And I wrote a piece actually at the time for The Guardian, for the Guardian Australia, about sort of my family vacation in Australia to the Blue Mountains, which were shrouded in smoke. We didn't see those magnificent vistas that it's known for because the entire valley was shrouded in the smoke from these bushfires. And it was, back in Sydney, I could see and smell the smoke. And in fact, it sort of changed my whole routine. We didn't want to spend much time outdoors because the air quality was as dangerous in Sydney, Australia, as it was in Beijing, China. That's the profound impact that that those bushfires had on air quality. And there were, days where you would look at the air quality charts and you'd see red in that entire region, unsafe to be outside breathing that air. So it was a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call for all of us, certainly for Australians. And I was able to have a conversation with Australia, with the Australian people over several months. And I almost felt like I was one of them at that point. And I developed a real kinship with our friends down under. But I think more than that, it was a wake-up call for the rest of us. This is what's coming for the rest of us if we don't act. And you alluded to, in California, in fact, we're seeing, the same thing. In fact, one of the problems is they don't have enough aircraft, for firefighting aircraft down in Australia, because you have overlapping fire seasons now in California and Australia. They're supposed to happen at different times of the year, but as things get hotter and drier, the fire season expands. California has some of their worst wildfires now in midwinter, which never used to be the case. That's out of season. That's not part of the conventional fire season. And so the fire seasons are overlapping, which means that there are limited, the aircraft that are available to fight these wildfires become limited, because you're competing. You see competition between the two hemispheres, different locations on the globe, and there are a finite number of these aircraft.
We lost her again.
I'm sorry. I have one last question about Australia. Having been there, it's just shocking. I mean, it was the most beautiful trip I've ever had. I was outside every day. It was the same time of year, just 1 year earlier than you. I can't fathom not being able to go outside. It was just, like the most ideal, beautiful place, clear skies, beautiful weather. So it's just impossible to even conceptualize, without having seen it. But it's interesting that we're talking about air quality because of COVID. And we know that we desperately need fresh air. If anyone has COVID, it's going to exacerbate it. If they get COVID, any kind of lung compromised issues are a terrible combination. So it's something to think about in terms of those two crises happening simultaneously.
That's right. It also gets at some very critical issues of sort of climate justice and environmental justice, where, if you have a compromised respiratory system because you live in an area that has poor air quality, then you're more susceptible to COVID-19. And I believe that African-American and Latino communities are seeing COVID-19 rates that are something like 2 times or 3 times the background level, and at least a 2 times greater likelihood of mortality. And so this is really highlighting some of the critical issues that we've been talking about lately when it comes to social justice, and in this case, environmental justice.
Absolutely.
Well, hi, Michael. I'm just want to say I'm very happy to meet you here.
Thanks.
And thank you again for being with us. I'm by nature a very optimistic person. And I'm thinking of the 7 generations, and I'm thinking of the generations of children to come, and what I don't want people to lose hope. I know it's really hard. It's very difficult for us. We keep hearing different time frames of, if we don't do something in 10 years or 12 years or however soon, if we don't do something soon, it's too late, it's too late, it's too late. So I guess basically, I would like to know what you would tell not only us, but how do we tell children and kids coming up for the future? What do we tell them or what is your response to them when you speak to them?
Yeah, so, the point I always try to stress is, just as you've alluded to, there is great urgency. We can sort of unpack that a little bit more and talk about the numbers and what we need to do. But there's great urgency, but there's also agency. There are things that we can do and are doing. And, as we began this conversation talking about some of the critical developments just this last week when it comes to sort of the supply side of the problem, pipelines that are delivering natural gas and oil that have been shut down now. And so that's real progress. We need to go much farther than that. And we need solutions not just on the supply side, but what we call the demand side. That is to say, we have to decrease demand for fossil fuels by providing incentives for renewable energy. I would argue by putting a price on carbon, and a number of things that we can do in this, this climate bill that's been put forward by House Democrats. Proposes to do those things. And so this is a bill right now. Of course, it can't pass Congress because we have a Senate that's controlled by Republicans who are unwilling to act on this issue right now. But in a matter of months, we could see a very different atmosphere in Washington, D.C., no pun intended, where there is an opportunity to actually see a climate bill pass, maybe even with some moderate conservatives, some moderate Republicans who feel alienated by what their party has become and are willing to sort of cross the aisle and join with Democrats putting forward a plan like this. So now the numbers are stark, you know, and as you say, there are these, it's so confusing. It's almost a whiplash. We're told 10 years and then we're told 12 years. We have no idea what, you know, that even means, because rarely is that really unpacked in a way that people understand where that comes from and what it really means. The bottom line is, you know, it isn't a cliff that we go off of. If we warm the planet, and many of these targets are aimed at keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, a little less than 3 degree Fahrenheit warming of the planet relative to the pre-industrial, because that's a level of warming where, you know, we understand that we will start to see some very bad impacts of climate change. But hey, we're already seeing dangerous climate change. If you're on Australia, if you're a low-lying island nation that's now facing inundation, if you're, you know, Puerto Rico was devastated by an unprecedented hurricane several years ago, and they're still recovering from that. And we can go on down the list. In so many places, if you're California and you lost your home to one of these wildfires, you might have even lost family members. Dangerous climate change has arrived. It's arrived. So it's a question of getting off this highway at the earliest exit. And just to wrap that up, that thread, if we miss the 1.5 degrees Celsius, 3 degree Fahrenheit exit, which this 10-year number is geared, bring carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 within 10 years if we are to avert warming of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if we miss that target, you know what? We still want to get off at the 2 degree Celsius exit. It's not a cliff that we walk off. It's a dangerous highway, and we want to get off that highway as quickly as we can.
So I think what you're saying is that there are people in the world that are working really, really hard, just as hard, to help us to get through this and do the right thing. Yeah. I mean, we have, I guess I get the same feeling, you know, when I listen to the civil rights and all the things that people fight for, and sometimes they feel like they really make a noise and they really are heard, and then nothing changes, you know. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia was quite a big event that you'd think would wake people up, and then all of a sudden we look back and we say, well, my God, that was a while ago, and what changed? What happened, you know? And so I guess when I think about the kids and I think about the future, I want to tell them, you know, there are people that are with us and they're working really hard. So, you know, join us. Let's do it together, and let's you know, do our best. And what do you suggest are some of the things that we can do, yeah, just ourselves?
Well, you know, the most important thing is to be talking about it, make sure it's part of the conversation. And, you know, the children have sort of shown us the way. You know, over the last, you know, couple of years, we've seen these massive strikes by children, Fridays for the Future, children literally striking from school to raise awareness, to march, to demonstrate, to protest. And it's really changed the conversation. In fact, it's shifted things so dramatically, public opinion so dramatically, that OPEC, this consortium of oil-producing nations, has declared that Greta Thunberg and the child climate protesters are the greatest threat that they face. Wow. Greatest threat that the fossil fuel industry faces because of the moral clarity with which they speak. And that's been the thesis of my next book, is really that there are a number of things that have come together in a way that provides us an unprecedented opportunity. And you're right, it always feels like we're being told we're just 10 years around the corner. Just wait, we're almost there, we're almost there. But tipping points do happen. We saw a tipping point happen some years ago when it comes to marriage equality. We are in a tipping point moment right now when it comes to racial justice. And we're seeing public opinion move unprecedented amounts, a really dramatic increase in the proportion of the country that is willing to accept now that we do have fundamental problems when it comes to racial justice, and we do need to do something about it. So we're in one of those moments now. And if you look at the numbers, and there are interesting, there's interesting research that looks at social tipping points and sort of what's required. And typically you don't need a majority of the public. What you need is maybe 25 to 30% of the population that is extremely engaged on an issue, devoted to that issue. That is often enough support to sort of create a larger transition where you bring on board a large percent of the population, and you see public opinion move like it's moving right now on issues of racial justice, from a minority opinion to a substantial majority opinion. And then you're ready to see policy. Then politicians have a mandate to actually do what they're there to do, which is to actually put in place policies to move us in that direction. So I feel like we're there on climate. All the pieces are in place. There's a core sort of group that, if you look at Democrats, for example, climate change in recent polling ranks at the very top in primacy among, the priority issues for Democrats. And Democrats are about half of the country. So if you work out the math, we're at that sort of 25 to 30% of the public that says climate change is the most important thing. We've got the children's, the youth climate movement. We have some very important developments on the policy front with pipelines and protests, which have helped sway public opinion so that these pipelines, they find themselves in an unfavorable political environment. And that's what's happened here, where they realize there's just so much opposition and they face so much potential litigation that it isn't worth it for them to actually invest in these pipelines. So all that stuff is happening right now. Of course, what we have, the problem is we have a president and we have a Congress, at least Republicans in the Senate, who refuse to do our bidding and instead are doing the bidding of powerful polluting interests. That can all change in a matter of months. You talk about a tipping point. We can see a tipping point in 3 months. If people go out and vote, and they vote on this issue, they vote on climate.
So, but what are you saying? There's we're not talking about a lot of the things that were in the big conversation politically right before COVID, which was, a lot of the disappointed Bernie followers, essentially, right? And people who say, well, Biden's too in the middle, will he really do enough for the climate? Will he do enough for the environment? What is your answer to that?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that he's on the right side of this issue. Now, he might not seem like he's got the fire in the belly that Bernie had when it comes to the climate issue. And you could make that case for others. Jay Inslee of Washington, certainly, climate change was his key issue. So, to me, it's a matter of, the potential of the perfect being the enemy of the good. Biden didn't get an A+ rating from Greenpeace on climate, but he got a B+. And that's a heck of a lot better than Trump, who doesn't even deserve an F, because an F in my book could be 60%. Trump gets 0%. It's an F minus, if that were a grade that we could even offer. And so it's night and day. What is true is that it will be important for climate voters and citizens, climate activists. We always have to hold our politicians accountable, even the good ones. We have to make, because it's the squeaky wheel. Surely, the lobbyists are going to be there trying to coerce them to vote in a way that's favorable for their interest. So we've got to be there. We've got to continue to, and that's why I say we've got to be talking about this issue. We've got to be voting on this issue. We need to, work with organizations, join environmental organizations that are working to lobby politicians, to put pressure on our policymakers, because as individuals, we can't pass climate legislation. Only our policymakers can do that. But there are collective actions that we can take part in that put pressure on those policymakers. And then finally, there are things that we can do in our everyday lives. I think there's a danger in sort of the narrative that sometimes starts to emerge that the real solution to this problem is individual behavior. If we just all became vegans and didn't fly, that would somehow solve the problem. And that just won't solve the problem. We should surely all do those things that we can do to minimize our carbon footprint and our environmental footprint. And they set a great example for other people, and it does make a difference. But what we need are incentives at the very top to make sure that everybody is moved in that direction. Even the people who aren't actively thinking about climate change are nonetheless actually sort of, they're nonetheless moved in the direction of making the right decisions, because the economic incentives that are in place help move them in that direction. And that means, subsidies for renewable energy. It means a price on carbon. It means, incentives for carbon-friendly, climate-friendly practices in the agricultural sector. There's no magic bullet. There are carbon emissions that come from every facet of modern life. And so we need a comprehensive strategy. We need people who are engaged. We need policymakers who are willing to represent those people rather than the corporate interests who often have funded their campaigns in the past. And so it's all of the above. It's people, it's individuals, it's collective action, and it's policy. And all those things are, in my view, we're at a point right now, we're at a nexus where where the environment may become favorable for all of those things aligning in a way that finally gives us that tipping point on climate that we're all awaiting, and I think we're nearing.
It's really, really heartening to hear. You're very, very positive. I have a question which has to do with, do you feel that with COVID, that this may overshadow our paying attention to this issue?
Well, there's that danger, and certainly that's what we saw in Australia. I was there to experience it. I ended up coming home in mid-March. Originally, I was going to stay through the beginning of May, but I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to travel back to the country. There was so much uncertainty at the time. I decided to cut that short. Nonetheless, I was there long enough to watch this transition, where we'd had these epic wildfires, these bushfires that had raised public awareness to levels never seen before in Australia. And the polling really bears that out. It was a new level of awareness that it really did open people's eyes to the reality that that the climate crisis has arrived. And yet, Australians didn't really have a time to reflect on all of that, because what happened by the time the bushfires were over, and in fact, it wasn't just the bushfires, it was the floods that came next and all that ash flowing into the rivers and killing off fish populations. So and the Great Barrier Reef was going into its third bleaching event in the last 5 years. And all of that was coming together. And then we're suddenly dealing with another, even more acute crisis in some sense, which was the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis. And so Australians were sort of I almost think of it as being denied that grieving period to reflect on what they had just been through, because we went from one crisis to another without any time in between, again, for that sort of, for that reflection. And, you know, obviously there are many things that were unfortunate about the pandemic that we face right now, but one of the unfortunate consequences were that we didn't really get the opportunity to entirely reflect and assimilate and absorb what we had been through. And because of that, I fear it won't have the sort of, it may not have the permanent impact on public opinion that I think it otherwise would have if we had had some time to sort of let that gel and really sink in and digest it fully and continue to have a conversation about what we had just been through. Here in the US, somewhat similar. We have, of course, seen all sorts of devastating climate-related extreme events in recent years, from the California wildfires to unprecedented floods in Houston and North Carolina and Louisiana, to superstorms that have devastated the coasts of Puerto Rico and Florida. And this summer now we're seeing record heat indices in the South Central states, unprecedented combinations of heat and humidity that are, you know, that are dangerous and are likely to lead to a loss of life. But we're so focused and appropriately on this nearer crisis, in a sense. Climate change feels abstract and far off. It's not. But it still to some extent feels that way. And the pandemic is so immediate that it's drawn our attention, and it's drawn it away from the climate crisis. And the challenge is for us to use the awareness that we are creating in how we deal with the pandemic, this current health crisis, to use the awareness that that creates and to parlay that into a greater appreciation of this longer term crisis. That's the challenge on all of us, to find a way to do that, to use this as an opportunity to start to ask some larger questions about, you know, environmental sustainability and what you know, what we want this planet to look like and what's our role.
Really excellent points. Dennis, did you have another question, or you?
No, go ahead, Heidi.
Okay. So I'm thinking a little bit about colleagues I have in the Marshall Islands right now, and they're facing sort of triple threat of COVID, climate change swallowing up their islands, and also the legacy of nuclear weapons. So they have, you know, this Inuit dome that is cracking, and has been left for them to resolve from nuclear weapons that were detonated as tests, you know, in the 1950s. And so they've got this kind of triple problem. What do you say to them?
Yeah, there's something profound about that, because, you know, war and issues of conflict have taken so much of our sort of collective resources. We've put so much money and effort into building up, you know, arsenals, weapons arsenals, that, you know, all of that capital, all of that investment, all of that, all those resources could have been used to solve the basic challenges that we face when it comes to providing space and safe drinking water and food to 7 billion and 7.5 billion and growing people. And so it's sort of a tragedy that our inability to get along and conflict has forced us to use precious resources, to divert precious resources that are then not available to help us meet our basic needs as a civilization. And they come back to haunt us in these other ways, right? Because of nuclear waste and the legacy, the long legacy that has on human health. And here's the kicker. Climate change is going to exacerbate issues of insecurity, food security, and national security, and conflict, right? When you have actually more like 7.8 billion and growing people competing for less space and less water and less food, in part because of the impact that climate change is having on those resources. That creates sort of a, if you forgive the expression, a perfect storm of sort of factors that contribute to conflict, to global conflict. And the fact is that, for example, ISIS, when you think about sort of global terrorist organizations, well, those organizations arose in environments where many of these factors were at play. In Syria, they've had the worst drought in as far back as the tree ring scientists can go, 900 years. So they faced this unprecedented drought in Syria over the last decade or so that forced rural farmers into the cities like Aleppo, where they were competing with the people who are already there for space and for food and for water. And that created conflict and unrest, which is a perfect recruiting environment for a terrorist organization that tells them, look, we can solve all your problems if you become part of our effort. And so it's so misguided when you hear someone like our president saying, well, we have to focus on the real threats like terrorism rather than the fake threat of climate change. Well, actually, the very real threat of climate change exacerbates these other threats. It's what we call a threat multiplier. And so the reality is that climate change is only going to increase these global conflicts, which, if we're not thoughtful about how we manage this, forces us to even put more of our precious resources into defense and security, and denies us the ability to solve the larger social problems that we face. That's a path that's a path we don't want to go down, and that's a path that climate change will take us down if we don't act.
I have just a thought. When I think about the indigenous people and what they're going through, but also thinking back on, there's a lot of people that have that same mindset today. I mean, indigenous people, their priorities have been like the water and keeping the water clean, because we know we can't live without water, keeping the air clean, we can't live without breathing, things like that. We're always, in my, in my mind, we're always priorities for indigenous people. And I think there's a lot of people today that understand that. And we try to keep those priorities in our lives. But, it seems like there's also this battle with people who put money first. Money first, always money first, ahead of everything else. And so how do we balance the economy, I guess, versus the environment when it comes to those things, so that we can be sustainable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll tell you, it's an issue that I was grappling with just this last week, because of a journalist who wrote an article for, I'm trying to remember the outlet, but you can find it if you do a Google search. But it was about I think it was Salon. I think the outlet was Salon, and it was an article about William Nordhaus, a Yale economist who got the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for his work on sort of climate economics, cost-benefit analysis, using what are known as integrated assessment models, where you run a climate model and you feed it into an economic cost-benefit analysis, where you try to estimate the costs of the damage done by climate change, and on the one hand, and the ostensible cost of taking action, of decarbonizing our economy, and sort of the implicit framework is that these two things are at odds somehow, when in fact they're not, because climate change, through all of these negative impacts, is obviously going to have a negative impact on our economy. If you don't have thriving human civilization, you don't have an economy. And so these models have been criticized, I think, to some extent for really undervaluing the basic utility of maintaining a habitable planet, right? And although he got the Nobel Prize, Nordhaus, for his work, some people feel like it sort of led us down the wrong path, where we start to ask questions like, well, how much is the Greenland ice sheet worth? If we melt the Greenland ice sheet, then we get, meters of sea level rise. And that would be devastating. By some measure, if we don't act on climate change, and if we fail to act, completely fail to act on climate change, there are scenarios where we can envision the end of civilization as we know it. And if there is no civilization, as I said, there is no economy. And so sometimes these approaches, these modeling approaches, try to answer the wrong question. They set up the problem in a way that sort of presupposes that we can separate these things in a way that we can't. And so I would argue, and ironically, Nordhaus's model ends up indicating that there's no reason really to try to save the Greenland ice sheet, because, hey, you can just, by not doing that, by not investing in mitigation, you can use that money to grow the economy, and somehow with enough economic growth and wealth, we can figure out, well, some technology will come along that'll tell us how to rebuild an ice sheet. Well, no, we can't rebuild an ice sheet. There are things that we can break through our inaction that no amount of technology or wealth can fix. And I think that's the understanding we have to come to. And it really brings, in my mind, it brings, it sort of highlights the principle of precaution, the precautionary principle in the face of uncertainty. And there is uncertainty as to just how much warming will cause the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet and the associated meters of sea level rise. There is some uncertainty in precisely how much warming we will see if we continue with business as usual burning of fossil fuels. Yes, there is uncertainty, but uncertainty isn't our friend. It can just as easily cut against us. And if you look at the history of the science, to some extent, that has been the case. The more we learn, the more we realize that things can change faster and the impacts can be greater than our models had predicted just, a decade ago or so. So I think that we have to be very careful. There is, when we talk about things like a price on carbon, then the price you set on how much it costs to put a ton of carbon into the atmosphere. And some people say the damage is as little as $50. Others would say it's closer to $1,000. And that all depends, it's uncertain because the impacts of climate change are uncertain. But that simply points to the sort of the limitations in, for example, setting a price on carbon. That can be one tool in our toolbox, but it can't be the only tool. We need other incentives to move towards renewable energy. We need a much more comprehensive approach to thinking about and acting on climate change than simply setting some price on carbon, because we know that there are limitations in our ability to estimate what the true price is. But that uncertainty, if anything, could lead us to make the wrong decisions, to not act quickly enough. And there is only one Earth, right? There is only one planet. There's no planet B. If we screw this one up, there's no other place to go. And that has to be at the forefront of the conversation. We always have to keep that in mind. And we have to be careful about ceding too much ground to the economists, when implicit in those economic models are all sorts of fundamental ethical assumptions that, for example, there is a use of what's known as social discounting, just like, in financial markets, $100 today is worth more than me promising to give you $100 a year from now because of the opportunity cost. There are things that you can do with that $100 now that you wouldn't be able to do if you have to wait a year for it. And so economists will sometimes use financial discounting rates, like the rates of return on a 30-year treasury bond or something like that, to discount the future, to say that negative impacts of climate change in the future should be downweighted. Because, hey, we can just generate wealth now and use that wealth and technology to solve problems in the future. That has all sorts of ethical undercurrents to it. Essentially what you're doing when you do that is you're downweighting the future of the planet, and you're downweighting the lives of our children and our grandchildren. And that's all sort of swept under the rug with these economic models, where it's just a parameter in the model, but buried in that parameter are all sorts of arguably objectionable ethical assumptions.
I have two difficult questions to ask you, or you may not like them, but I think about them. I teach a lot of post-apocalyptic literature, and I would say I lean toward wondering, how bad can it get, really? And what will the world look like if we do nothing and we just continue on this path?
It's a great question, and the good news is that we don't have to use our imaginations, because Hollywood has already depicted that for us. We can create a dystopian future like Mad Max, actually one of the more prescient Hollywood dystopian films was Soylent Green back in the early 1970s. If you watch the very beginning of the film, you find out that the premise is actually climate change. It was ahead of its time in that regard. I guess you have to give some kudos to Charlton Heston for being ahead of his time when it comes to environmental awareness. He may have been wrong-headed on a whole lot of other things, but that film actually was prescient and there were sort of there was a whole array of sort of dystopian films in the early 70s, at a time when we were really starting to confront some of the issues, global environmental pollution and our impact on the environment, and the fact that we could have an impact on the environment of the entire planet, and that growing awareness. Out of that came a very rich array of interesting sort of dystopian films that collectively portray a possible future. I think they're actually accurate. Soylent Green is probably accurate. In a planet with 7.8 billion and growing people, if climate change leads to a dramatic decrease, as I said before, in food and water and space at a time of growing, that sort of sets potentially sets us up for a dystopia, Hollywood type dystopian future. So that's one possible future, right? And we should be aware of that. And that's the urgency that I talk about. That's why there is urgency, because we could create a terrible future for our children and grandchildren and ourselves. We can see substantial degradation just within our lifetimes, but far more in the future. And do we want that to be our legacy? That is one possible future. But there's an alternative future where we act on this problem now. And there's some reason for hope. We've done this before. We acted in time to avert the destruction of the ozone layer by listening to what science had to tell us, and actually bringing industry together with governments and putting in place policies like the Montreal Protocol that banned fluorocarbon depleting chemicals. And we're still recovering from that problem, but we've seen the tide turn. Acid rain, again, we actually, under a Republican administration, under George Herbert Walker Bush, his EPA administrator, William K. Riley, who was actually an environmentalist and had credentials as a champion of environmental sustainability, introduced the concept of cap and trade. That was actually developed as a business model for pricing the externality, for forcing businesses to pay a price for producing pollution that was worsening the acid rain problem. And we've seen, the lakes and rivers and forests in the Northeast return as a result of that. In the cabin that we go to most every summer in the Adirondacks, where my family, my wife's family, they've been going there for generations, for more than 50 years. And they saw things die off in the 1970s, and they've seen the lakes come back as well. So we know that we can solve these problems through appropriate policies. It is possible to do that. We can do that here. It's a bigger problem in a sense because it gets at the very heart of our global economic model right now, which is still highly dependent on the burning of fossil fuels. To some extent, it's a more pervasive problem than acid rain or ozone depletion, but we can look to those past successes as models. We know what we have to do. We know what the solution is. No Bill Gates, we don't need a miracle. Sorry, we don't need a miracle. It's already here. It's wind, it's solar, it's geothermal. We know what to do. We just need policies that move us in that direction.
I have a question that's a burning question for me, and then we're going to start taking questions from unless Dennis has more questions. But this is a question that is, it was popular in the 60s and 70s, but has sort of dropped off in favor, which is population control. And I know a lot of young people are saying, I'm not going to have children. I'm afraid about the world that I'm bringing, that I would bring my children into. But I'm just curious from a scientist's point of view, what about population control?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. And it's a difficult one because there are so many intersecting issues when we talk about population. If we're not careful, there are sometimes it's been framed in a way that sort of puts the onus on the developing world, where population increases have been the greatest. It's easy for those of us in the wealthy industrial world to say, hey, the problem is just all the growing population in third world countries, when in fact we know from sort of basic demographic patterns that if we provide assistance to those people, education and resources, and we help them out of poverty, that those, and most important of all is educating women about their choices. And there's lots of research that suggests that if we put resources into those things, then we can help people lead better lives. And we will see reproduction rates decrease and become more sustainable. So rather than blaming people in other parts of the world, we need to provide them the resources to meet their basic needs so that they, don't go down this a path of depleting, their own available resources. And it's, when it comes to the climate change problem in particular, it's especially misguided to blame people in India and Africa when their carbon footprints are orders of magnitude smaller than our carbon footprints here in the industrial world. The climate problem isn't a problem of too many people per se. It's too many people who are burning too much carbon to generate too much energy and to use up too much of our resources. And so decarbonizing our economy is very important, and making sure that, especially in places like India and Africa, as they begin to develop their energy infrastructure, to help them leapfrog past this unnecessary stage. They don't need to go through the fossil fuel stage that we went through in the Western world, because we have something better now, renewable energy. And that's the going forward, that's the logical direction for developing countries to go as well. They don't need to create a fossil fuel driven energy grid. It makes much more sense for them to use decentralized renewable energy, solar and wind, and let's help them do that. And that's a really important part of the climate solution, is to help developing countries leapfrog past the fossil fuel stage. Just like, we don't require school children today to first learn how to use an abacus before we let them use a calculator and eventually a computer. We skip past all those things now because we have better technology. Same thing's true with energy. So, I think it's too easy to blame the problem on, people in third world countries, and increasing populations in third world countries, when it has much more to do with our use of, our extraction of resources, using up resources. And in the Western world, we are far more, we use far more basic resources than people in the third world.
That's such a great answer. I love it. And it made me think of, in the middle there, Wendell Berry talking about, one person can consume a huge amount. So it's not about numbers. It's about
That's
how
right.
much we consume.
Absolutely. Now, there are some limits that we ultimately will come up against, right? There only are a finite number of people that can live on a planet with finite resources. And there, ecologists for years have debated what the true carrying capacity of the planet is. Some estimate it's a billion people. And we're almost an order of magnitude larger than that. And the way we maintain that is through massive infrastructure that we've created to sort of artificially boost the effective carrying capacity of the planet. But that makes us so dependent on that infrastructure. And as we've seen with COVID-19, when that infrastructure starts to crumble, how vulnerable we become. And so there are some larger questions that we need to ask. And again, we need to provide resources, education in particular, that help people make the right choices so that we do live within sustainable limits on this planet.
And the last, just that other point you made that was so important, which is educating women.
Yeah, nothing is more important than that. Helping them to make the right choices, and it's not that hard to do. We just need to prioritize that more than we're doing right now.
I think, Heidi, we could turn things over to some of the questions from the
Definitely, let's do that. I'm sure people have lots of questions.
People listening. I have quite a few here, and I think some of them have kind of been answered indirectly as far as population and things like that. But I'll ask you one that I know I would never ask.
I'll try to make this more of a lightning round because so we can get in as many as possible.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Here we go. For Dr. Mann, what do you think is the role for carbon capture and sequestration technologies as a strategy to reduce carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere? And the same person asked after that, which environmental climate topic concept do you think needs the most immediate research right now? I don't know if those things overlap or not, but I'll let you.
Yeah, interesting. Well, for the first one, carbon capture and sequestration can mean two different things. It can mean collecting the CO2 that's produced, for example, by a coal-fired power plant, and collecting it so that it doesn't make it into the atmosphere, and burying it, turning it into basically, stone, reacting it with chemicals that turn it into basically rock, or burying somehow that carbon deep under the surface of, or in the deep ocean. It can also mean actually trying to suck CO2 back out of the atmosphere, and that's called direct air capture. And those are two very different things. Now with CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, typically when people talk about that, they're talking about like coal-fired power plants, requiring them to capture their carbon and bury it. And if they do that, then they can produce energy without producing carbon pollution. That assumes that they're able to capture, all of the CO2, and in practice, it turns out there's some failure rate. There's probably a 10% failure rate, and so you can't capture all the CO2. And when you bury it, you can't always be sure that you've buried it in a place that's safe where it'll stay for the long term. So there are lots of uncertainties that arise. But here's the fundamental problem there. Coal right now is struggling to compete, even without a price on carbon, even without the incentives that we should be providing for renewable energy, just given the current realities of the global energy marketplace. Coal is really struggling. Now, if we make coal-fired power plants capture their carbon and bury it, and that will add greatly to the expense, the operating expense, we will price them completely out of the market. So I don't think that coal with CCS, capture and sequestration, is viable. I don't think it's economically viable without, government subsidies. Why should we be subsidizing fossil fuels? We should be subsidizing renewable energy that doesn't come with this problem of producing carbon pollution.
Absolutely.
So to me, CCS has political appeal to those who would like to keep the coal industry alive, but it just doesn't make much sense to me in the grand scheme of things. Now, the second question was, what's the most important, can you say that again?
Sure, it's the same person. Which environmental climate topic, concept do you think needs the most immediate research right now?
Well, there are a lot of them. There are a lot of directions we could go with that, because we could be talking about impacts, climate change impacts, or we could be talking about mitigation. We just talked about CCS. Is it viable? Well, there's more research that could arguably be done to look into not just that, but direct air capture, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Is that viable? That might be a stopgap sort of solution if we are seeing CO2 levels rise to dangerous levels and we're not sort of acting fast enough. Some people said, well, then maybe we need to turn to one of these sort of stopgap solutions like direct air capture. Surely, certainly there should continue to be research into these areas, but I would argue that a much, more important thing right now is, first of all, getting a better sort of handle on climate change impacts on extreme weather events and the relationship between climate change and extreme weather events. Some of my own research suggests that there are factors that are not well captured in the climate models that are leading to a greater intensification of these very persistent weather extremes like we've seen in recent summers here in the Northern Hemisphere, like they've seen down in Australia. We're seeing sort of a greater incidence of these dangerous weather extremes than the climate models predict. And that means that there's still work to be done in sort of refining the models so they're able to capture these impacts, because that really, heavily influences, for example, if you want to try to put a price on carbon, you want to figure out how much damage, carbon pollution is doing to us and to the planet, then you really need to be able to account for the impact that it's having on some of these devastating extreme weather events. So to me, that's an important research area, but there's also important work to be done on mitigation, and adaptation. What can we do to contend with the impacts of increasingly worse droughts in many regions, more extreme flooding events, and devastating heat waves. There's a study that just came out last week that shows how profound an impact climate change has had on the incidence of devastating heat waves. All of these things are important. I wouldn't want to make a decision. I wouldn't want to be the one who decides, which of those. There's just so much that needs to be done. I would say that we need to see more prioritization of funding for research than we see under the current government in the US, for example.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michael. I have a question for you from Ardith Plate, who I happen to know, who was an She's a self-proclaimed anti-nuclear nun. She's actually a Catholic nun, and she's been to jail and prison over 30 times,
Whoa.
protesting for peace and disarmament. And on this day, in 2013, the UN passed the disarmament treaty, the ban the bomb treaty, and I actually had the honor of meeting her there at that extraordinary event. And she's just a wonderful human being. So she asks, the military complex continued during the months of this serious pandemic to spend huge amounts of funding on their weapons and budget. And she wonders if there's a way we could change this, because they are also significant polluters and contributors to climate change.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, at a very basic level, as I alluded to earlier, we're all of these resources that we could be putting into dealing with the pressing problems that we have on a finite planet with nearly 8 billion people unable, in many cases, to have access to fresh drinking water or food on their plate. These are the problems that we need to solve. And what a shame to be wasting money on expansion of the military when, you know, in principle, that just points to the need for greater diplomacy. The real solution isn't to build up ever larger, you know, nuclear arsenals and weapons arsenals. I thought we had learned that lesson already. The solution is for us to be more thoughtful in how we go about international diplomacy. Unfortunately, right now, the U.S., you know, the current president has not been engaged meaningfully in diplomacy with our you know, the other countries of the world, having unilaterally withdrawn from the Paris Accord. And now, just today, Trump announced that he wants to withdraw from the World Health Organization. So at a time when we need to be working together with the global community to solve the great problems that we face, the US has become a bad actor on the international stage. But that can all end in 3 months. We can go in a different direction.
So, Michael, I have a couple of people ask pretty much the same question, and I'm sure you probably get this quite a bit, so I'm going to kill two questions here at once. It says, don't we have to get rid of capitalism to avoid a dystopian future, and don't we have to abolish capitalism? And so you probably get that quite a bit. So I guess that plays a little bit into our economy versus environment message, but how do you respond to that?
It does, and I think that you know, I think that it's the real answer is a little more nuanced because you know, sort of there is this notion of unregulated free market capitalism, right? That has been championed by, you know, neoconservatives. And this idea that the market can somehow solve all problems on its own. We know that that's not true. So, you know, the idea of pure unregulated capitalism, clearly that's not a viable, it's not a viable policy framework for a sustainable planet because of, you know, what we've been alluding to, these externalities, you know, the damage that's done to all of us when we pollute with carbon pollution or we degrade the environment. And that's why we need regulations. That's why we need restrictions. That's why there need to be, you know, what's happened, unfortunately, under the current administration, for example, but it's a direction that the Republican Party has been moving towards since, you know, the Reagan era, at least, is sort of deregulation and dismantling environmental protections that had been put in place even by Republicans like Richard Nixon in the EPA back in the early 1970s. So the real problem here, I think, is not so much capitalism itself, because I think capitalism with appropriate constraints and safeguards and regulations is a potentially viable economic model. The problem is that the problem is sort of this laissez-faire capitalism, this sort of deregulatory ideology that has emerged in the Republican Party over the last several decades. Clearly, that's not viable. Clearly, if we neglect the damage that our activities can do to the global commons, to our environment, that'll take us down an unsustainable path. I'm not willing to say that there isn't some form of appropriately regulated capitalism that is consistent with a sustainable planet. But I am prepared to say that the sort of version of capitalism that we see championed by Republicans today is not a sustainable model.
Okay. Heidi, do you want to pick another one here, or you want me to go? I thought that was a good one here because it plays into our lightning round concept here.
Okay, so I'm really going to do lightning now. This is.
This person asked, and I have a feeling she probably has thrown this question. This question is probably thrown at her a lot. So she wants to know what is your quick response to answer? What is your most effective quick response when someone says, but the climate has been changing for millennia. Climate change is natural.
The rate of warming that we have seen over the last century is unprecedented as far back as we can go. So sure, 100 million years ago, when dinosaurs roamed the polar regions, carbon dioxide levels were higher than they are today, and temperatures were probably even warmer than they are today. But life had 100 million years to adjust to those changes. We are seeing similar changes happen on a time scale, not of 100 million years, but 100 years, 1 million times faster. And there is no evidence in the geological record that living things, let alone human beings, can actually adjust to rates of change that are that great.
Okay. Very good. Excellent. You know, I tried to get some of these questions in earlier. It says, didn't the dying Great Barrier Reef for several years bring the reality of climate change to the Australians? So I'm going to, it's not really, you know, the question is, did it bring reality to them? So we kind of covered that before. Another person asked, how is COVID
sinking in? I think reality is sinking in. That's my experience with Australians.
That's our hope, right?
Yeah.
And then another person.
There's a question about solar power. Did we get to that one? The most effective form of solar power that we could be using?
I didn't get down to that yet. Can you read it?
Sure. It is what's the most promising solar technology for everyday use that won't have unintended environmental consequences?
Yeah, I mean, so you know, there is an issue, and this gets at some of the questions that we were tackling earlier. You know, everything we do leaves some sort of environmental footprint. When we use energy, it's going to have an environmental footprint. We require, you know, the mining of metals to make solar panels and wind turbines, and the disposal. They have to be replaced, and you know, disposal. You know, there is the potential for, you know, hazardous materials to be released when it comes to the disposal of and the manufacturing of these materials. So everything we do has an environmental footprint. And at some level, there's some larger questions about environmental sustainability that go beyond the climate problem alone and do have to do with this question of, can we continue to extract, you know, can we continue to have an extraction-based global economy and expect sort of the possibility of living sustainably on this planet? I'm not sure that we can. And so we do ultimately have to, you know, we can't just continue to use more and more energy and more materials, even if we try to do that as sustainably as possible. And that does raise some larger challenges. And I don't claim to have the solution to some of these, you know, larger problems, other than We do have to think about, the capacity of this planet, how many people it can support, and what measures we take to try to make sure that we do remain within the sort of natural carrying capacity of the planet. I don't know if that gets at the specific question, but the fact is that, yeah, even solar panels and wind turbines and all these things leave an environmental footprint behind, and we can't neglect that.
And another question that was exactly, I think, related to that, it says, what about the new technologies as sources of new forms of pollution? As in, and I think this person touches on a real, a real problem, and that's, I think it was Easter Island. I saw the documentary on Easter Island where a lot of the waste from all over the world is ending up in, third world countries and these remote islands where it all seems to be, the burden is placed on all of these people who can least afford to deal with it. And we just, have to somehow find a way to not keep moving forward. So I guess, it's like you said, we have to create technologies that aren't just doing the same thing over and over and over again, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it sort of relates to this other question. The fact is that we do have this environmental footprint. Everything we do, when we use resources, when we use more energy, when we consume more food and water, it's going to leave behind an environmental footprint, and it does sort of bring to the surface some of these questions about environmental justice, because those of us with the most wealth and the most resources can sort of insulate ourselves from the negative impacts of that environmental footprint. And what you find are that the people who, live in the, in the most toxic environments with the most air pollution and the most polluted water invariably are the poor and frontline communities and people with the least resources. And that sort of conflicts with basic notions of justice. And so the fact is that an extractionist economy tends to be one in which the negative impacts are felt the most by those with the least resources. And extractionist economies do tend to be the ones with the greatest economic disparity. And so these are real, larger socioeconomic problems that we need to contend with and we need to think about. And that's why, a comprehensive climate bill, as the one that the Democrats have put forward, needs to take into account some of these related issues of environmental justice. We need a just transition away from fossil fuels and polluting sort of activities.
I'd like to add to that. I so support what you just said, and I'm thinking of my friends, the Navajo right now, who have very, very high COVID rates. Heat there must be horrific. Their medical facilities are abominable. They're just so unsupported. I mean, things have been improving a little bit because people have sent in some forces, but but I mean, this is an ongoing issue. They don't have proper medical care, and they're underfunded, and they're going to be dealing with, they're already dealing with uranium pollution, and now they're going to deal with the consequences of climate change, and they are dealing with it, and they have COVID. And so who gets most hurt? And these are people who consume the least, right? So just to kind of agree with you that this is a terrible problem worldwide.
Yep.
The injustice of it, the racial injustice of it. And we also know that women are hardest hit. Statistically, women and children.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons, it's a point I always try to drive home, that acting on climate is acting on social justice because of the social justice implications of climate change and environmental degradation in general.
Yes. Well, I think we're coming to a close here. It's my sense of things. I mean, there are more questions. If you want to just double check, Dennis, to see if you see a few more, but I think do you have any final words for us? As we, this is a pretty auspicious moment to be speaking with you, I have to say. I mean, you've spoken at my university before, and you're at many events, and I've heard you speak, and I just think this is a very, very particular time. Anything you could leave us with?
Well, thanks. Yeah, I do think it's a very special time right now because, this current pandemic crisis has caused us to start to reimagine what our world can look like. And we have an opportunity to remake the world, both in the sort of recovery, the transition out of this pandemic, but as it happens, because we're just months away from a presidential election where we can decide what sort of government we want and what our priorities are. And I've said it, before, and I'll say it again. That's why people need to be thinking about these issues and talking about them and creating an environment where collectively, as we go into this next election, people vote on issues, including climate and including social justice, all the things that we've talked about, because we get the politicians we vote for. And if we don't turn out and we leave it to, the other side, is very good at turning out their voters. And if progressives don't turn out, then we lose, and we get, we've seen the disaster that befalls us. Donald Trump, arguably the worst president of all time, in part because progressives didn't turn out to vote, and lost the Senate as well. So if progressives turn out in this next election, we have an opportunity to hit the ground running. We know what we need to do. We know what the solution is. We just need politicians who are willing to support these actions and vote. Make sure everybody who's of voting age votes in this next election, and vote early if you can.
Don't boo, vote.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Michael Mann, for joining us, for that clarifying reality check, and also for the hope you gave us. And thank you, Heidi and Dennis. That was incredible. So and thank you all of you, so many people joined us today. You gave us incredible questions. We're very grateful for that. This conversation was wonderful. And we'll be back next Tuesday at 7 with our second in this series about climate solutions. So we talked about a little bit of the issues. We'll get more deep into solutions next week. Heidi, do you want to tell them a little bit about our special guest next week?
Sure. Our special guest is Mark Jacobson, who is a wonderful engineer. He runs a program at Stanford University, and he has the solutions. He's also part of a project called the Solutions Project, and he's constantly working on, in a very detailed, careful, methodical way, on the solutions that are doable. And he's got a plan that basically, state by state in the United States, the way we can move forward with renewable energy, and globally. And his work is quite extensive and very impressive, and he's the head of an entire program that works on this at Stanford. So he's the Stanford Woods Fellow there, and he's a very impressive, wonderful person, and really works so hard for our planet. And a great follow-up to you, Dr. Mann. He's really—
I was going to say, Mark's work is actually implicit in many of my comments. I'm actually thinking about the work that he's done with the Climate Solutions Project, and demonstrating that, in fact, even using the technology we have, like I said, we don't need a miracle. Existing technology, wind, solar, geothermal, and conservation, just using those tools, we can meet, I think he's shown 80% of our energy needs from renewables by 2030, and 100%, I believe, by 2050.
Right.
So we know what the solution is. We know what to do. Yeah.
And he actually shows that it's cheaper than a lot of the technologies that we're using now. So it's less expensive. The question is, we just have to do it. So that's why I totally support Dr. Mann's point, which is we need to vote the right people in to make this happen, because it can be done. And that's where we are.
Fantastic. And just one quick point for those of you who signed up via Eventbrite. If you signed up for this first one, you're on our mailing list, so you will automatically be getting information about the next one, so you don't have to worry about doing too much. And you can always reach out to us at flowbellfoundation@gmail.com. This is produced by the Florence Belsky Foundation. If you want to find out more about us, you can go to flowbell.org. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for everyone for coming on. Tell your friends. Everyone's welcome.
Thank you so much, everybody.
And we're going to close out with the rest of